Hi there. Today's book to review is Prisoners of the Castle, Colditz, by Ben McIntyre. And I've previously reviewed several of Ben McIntyre's books. He's very prolific on subjects of military history and espionage, and he never lets you down. He always produces an excellent work. And I've been looking forward to this book. I previously reviewed The Traitor of Colditz, a book about a specific story which I hadn't heard of, about a certain episode in Colditz. But Ben McIntyre's book is a much more widely spread overview of the whole Colditz experience during World War II. Now, it's been said that Colditz was the basket where the Germans put all their bad eggs, all the escape risks and so on. It was supposed to be escape proof. In reality, it proved to be anything but escape proof. And I grew up reading books about Colditz. There were numerous ones, and it was kind of the really the pinnacle of the prisoner of war literature and movie experience at the time. So it was always in my consciousness. I read the books by Pat Reed and so on. He wrote many of them. And also there was a TV series, Colditz, which loosely based on it. But there was one episode of the TV series featuring the SOE, which was really, really well done, and I'll put a link to it. So many of the prisoners in Colditz from the various nations, there were British prisoners, there were Dutch prisoners, there were French prisoners, Polish prisoners, and so on, were there for a long time, from 1940, from the start of hostilities right through. And so, you know, they're a really terrible experience. Although being an officer prisoner of war wasn't as bad as being one of the other ranks, or being, for example, a Russian prisoner of war, where they were really badly treated, terribly badly treated. But Colditz was a forbidding place in Saxony, up on the hill. It was a castle, obviously, and it was pretty well designed as a prison to keep people in. Had a moat and all sorts of things. So some of the noted escapers that are discussed, Pat Reed, who together with an RAF colleague called Wardle, after a couple of attempts, actually did manage to get out and took a train, got to the Swiss border, crossed into Switzerland, and Pat Reed stayed in Switzerland working for SIS for the rest of the war. And it was him who wrote many of the books about Colditz. Airy Neve attempted to get out disguised as a German soldier, but his uniform unfortunately had a sort of luminous green glow to it under the searchlights, and he was spotted. And he did manage to, using better disguises, he got out and got all the way back to the UK, and was working for MI9, which was the Escape and Evasion Service. So they were the people who devised codes, devised specialized escape tools, and put stuff into parcels, disguised food, things like this. I previously reviewed a book on this by Clutty, who was the guy who made the kit or designed it. A very interesting book. So Erin Eve, of course, became a Tory politician and was assassinated by the IRA. So, talking about disguise, there was an officer, Michael Sinclair, who had already escaped several times and almost made it from other camps. He was known as the Red Fox, and they put him into, Gestapo gave him a hard time, then they put him into Colditz, and he continually tried to escape. And he and a couple of other guys had the fantastic idea of being disguised as a German sergeant major who they nicknamed Franz Josef. He had a big handlebar moustache, he was rather portly and an imposing figure. And Michael Sinclair, who spoke fluent German, disguised himself as the sergeant major, and he had a couple of other guys disguised as sentries, and the idea was to carry out a changing of the guard and then leg it. Now, when you think about it, the disguise actually worked. Now, how you can make convincing rifles, German uniforms, boots, a pistol in a holster, the right medals, ribbons, and speak convincingly in German as a guy that the sentries know. They did all that. The only thing that let them down is German sentry did get suspicious, and it was probably a subconscious, adding up of there's something not quite right here. Nothing specific, but just the overall. And he demanded a pass. They had a pass, it was forged, but unfortunately they'd got something on the forgery wrong, and they were captured. And Michael Sinclair, he was continually involved in escapes, but finally broke down, and he just made a bid for freedom and was shot, killed by a German sentry. A very tragic tale. So there's a couple of issues that are discussed by Ben McIntyre which weren't really discussed in the earlier histories, and one is racism. And there's a kind of because it's written from the British point of view, we come out of it well in some regards and badly in other regards. There was a contingent of French officers who were Jewish sent to Colditz, and the other French officers put them into kind of a ghetto, into a loft. They wouldn't have anything to do with them. They were very racist. But the British officers did. They welcomed them and socialised with them. So that was a plus. But then there was an Indian officer from the British Army. I've just got his name here. Mazumba. And he was a prisoner at Colditz. And then the Germans took him to Berlin. There was an Indian nationalist, Subhander Bose, who was the Germans were using to try and create an Indian element in the German forces against the UK, against Great Britain, and they took this chap to meet him to be recruited, and he wouldn't have anything to do with him, even though he did himself actually believe in Indian nationalism, as many did. But he said no. He was loyal to the crown and to his uniform, and he came back. But the British officers were suspicious of him and cold-shouldered him. It wasn't a very enlightening time. Another topic which in the previous books was never mentioned was homosexuality. And Ben McIntyre raises the topic. He doesn't really give any conclusive evidence that it was happening, but there were several officers who were known as being homosexual in Colditz. One who was captured, he was a commando, and he was captured at the Saint Nazaire raid, and he was bisexual, but he was quite open about it, and there were a couple of others. And so it's a topic that pretty obvious, I guess, in an all-male community for many, many years, many of whom came from boarding schools, so which is pretty similar environment. So I think he was right to discuss it. He mentions Douglas Bader. Now, I went to see the movie Reach for the Sky. The whole family, we all went. I was still at school, and I was mad about aviation and fighter pilots and everything. And I thought it was a wonderful film. And Kenneth More portrayed Douglas Bader in a very, very warm light. But I was dismayed a few years ago to start reading the truth about Douglas Bader. He was a terrible figure. He was boorish. He was rude. He treated underlings very, very badly, and he was a nightmare. And a thing I never realised in all the other books about Colditz was that the officers had batmen, other ranks, who were also prisoners in the castle and who had to serve the officers. Some of them didn't mind this so much because they're slightly better conditions than if they were just in a soldier's camp. But the chap who had to look after Bader had to carry him around on his back, and he treated him like an animal. But then it came to a period where the Germans decided that the batmen could be repatriated back home via Switzerland. And his batman came to him with this great news. I'm going home, sir. No, you're not. You're here to look after me. And he stopped him going home. Could you believe that? A terrible man. Absolute nightmare. A couple of other things. Alcohol was a subject, and the prisoners were always trying to get their hands on it, particularly for things like Christmas, New Year, and so on. But they used to distill their own, and out of all sorts of terrible things. And they made one drink which, if you left it in an enamel mug overnight, it would dissolve the enamel. So it will tell you how potent and deadly it was. But they will go to any lengths. The Germans, whenever they foiled an escape attempt, they would circulate the methods around to the other camps, and they kept a museum of escape aids and disguises and forgeries and things like this. And Reinhold Eggers, who was the security officer, he photographed the prisoners if they were disguised in any way. And it's all in the book. There's a very interesting one where they used to have a work party where they'd go they would have a recreation time where they'd go down to kind of a park under escort, and they could play football and so on. And they were on the way down there, and they passed a German woman, but she was middle-aged and not all that attractive, but she was the only woman. They'd been there for a long time. They were wolf whistling and so on. But she dropped a handkerchief, and one of the prisoners handed it to a guard, and he ran up to the woman and found it was a disguised Frenchman. And there's a picture in the book. Another Frenchman, who was obviously very handsome, started an affair with a young girl who was an assistant to the dentist in the Colditz town. And this went on for a long time, and she actually became kind of a spy for the camp, and she aided in bribery and in getting hold of passes and so on. And it is an amazing story. A reason that many of the escapes failed was Germany was a very efficient police state, and they had systems of passes, and they changed them at regular times, changed the colours, changed types of stamps on them, and all sorts of things. So it was very, very difficult to travel across Germany to get to the nearest border with Switzerland successfully, because to take a train you needed ID, and then you'd be talking to people on the train. So if you didn't speak fluent German, you had to pose as an itinerant foreign worker and be convincing in that role. One of the things that he talks about is, it's an appendix to the book, is the coding system they used, and it's a very complicated system, and it's very interesting to see it. And another thing was the importance of the Swiss Red Cross, both in supplying food parcels, which had things like warm clothing in as well, and they also acted as the conducting power who observed what was going on and acted on behalf of the prisoners. And I think any prisoner would tell you how grateful they were for that. And just a point, MI9 never interfered with the Red Cross parcels. Anything they sent to the prisoners was done from their own family parcels. So that was an important thing. There were a number of what was called prominente, VIP prisoners, some of whom were related to Churchill and so on, who were virtually hostages. And their position was very precarious at the end. And the SS had arrived in the village of Colditz, and there was big probability that the SS were going to take these prisoners and move them somewhere else and use them as a bargaining chip. It didn't happen, partly because the German staff at Colditz did their best to prevent this. So it was pointed out to them in no uncertain terms that would be a war crime. So they did protect the prominente as much as they could. And then the castle was finally liberated by the Americans. And, the guys then had to reacclimatise to freedom. Terrific book. I've only touched the surface of the stories in there. Really brilliant. Ben McIntyre's done it again, and I heartily recommend The Prisoners of the Castle.